It was 2010 and I was 9 years old, living in a quiet neighborhood where every kid knew each other. My friend Jake, a kid known for his daredevil attitude, made an intriguing discovery one summer day. His older brother, who was away at college, had left behind a curious artifact, an Ouija board. Jake, who had a knack for finding trouble, decided it would be exciting to play with it and invited me to join. The first attempt was a bust. In Jake's dimly lit room, we sat on the floor, the board between us, and tried to contact the spirit world. But nothing happened, and we were left with a feeling of disappointment. However, Jake's curiosity wasn't satisfied. A few days later, he called me, brimming with excitement. He had researched how to properly use the board and wanted to try again. This time, we set up the room like a scene from a movie. Scented candles casting flickering shadows on the walls, encircling the Ouija board. We were ready to dive into the unknown. We started the seance with a simple question. Is anyone there? To our amazement and growing apprehension, the planchette moved to yes. Both of us thought the other was moving it, but we decided to continue, half convinced it was just a silly game. Curious, we asked the spirit's name. The planchette slowly spelled out Owen. I remember the air in the room growing colder as we asked if Owen was a person. The planchette slid to no with an eerie decisiveness. Our hearts raced when we asked what it was, and it spelled out demon. In a mix of fear and bravado, I challenged the board to prove its claim. That's when we heard a sound from the garage, a call like something out of a horror movie, but distorted, unnatural. We were the only ones home, and the sound sent us sprinting out of the house, hearts pounding in our ears. In the following weeks, Jake began to notice strange occurrences. He felt an oppressive sense of being watched, especially in the kitchen and living room. At night, he sensed a weight at the end of his bed, as if someone was sitting there. Even walking past the garage, he felt an invisible force gripping his wrist, pulling him towards it. Each time I visited, an unnerving sensation crept over me, a feeling of being observed from above, as if eyes were boring into me from the ceiling. The atmosphere in Jake's house had shifted from one of comfort to one filled with a lingering dread. Then came the most terrifying episode. We were alone at his house, playing in his room, when the tranquility was shattered by heavy thudding footsteps downstairs. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard before, as if a large, hooved animal was pacing the living room. An unsettling laughter, intermingled with a rasping cough, resonated through the walls. In a state of panic, Jake slammed his bedroom door shut, and we scrambled to hide. I found refuge in his closet while he slid under the bed. The scratching started soon after, a sound so sinister it seemed to echo in my very bones. It was as if a giant claw was scraping at the door, seeking entry. Jake, tears streaming down his face, mustered the courage to yell, "Leave us alone. Owen, you're scaring us." The scratching ceased abruptly, replaced by the sound of whatever it was, retreating down the stairs. Gathering our courage, we ventured out of hiding. Jake grabbed the Ouija board from the closet. It had been there all along, a silent witness to our terror. He dashed downstairs to the gas fireplace, ripping off the screen, and hurled the board into the flames. As he reached to ignite the fire, a guttural moan echoed from the basement, freezing us in place. With a trembling hand, Jake turned on the fireplace. The board caught fire, the flames consuming it with an almost vengeful intensity. As it burned, the house felt lighter, as if a suffocating weight had been lifted. We spent the rest of the day outside, too afraid to step back into the house until Jake's parents returned. When they did, they were furious about the burned Ouija board and grounded Jake. They disposed of the charred remains, and with it, the paranormal activity ceased. I relayed the events to my mother, who listened with a mixture of skepticism and concern. But for Jake and me, the reality of our experience was undeniable. The Ouija board, a supposed channel to the other side, had brought something into our world, an entity that had terrorized us in the most unimaginable ways. Since then, I've steered clear of anything related to the occult. The memory of that summer, the sounds, the fear, and the sense of an otherworldly presence have stayed with me. It was a brush with something beyond our understanding, a reminder that some doors once opened can unleash horrors that are difficult to contain. We were no strangers to paranormal occurrences in our house. We'd seen fleeting shadows, heard unexplained noises, but nothing had prepared me for what happened that night. It all started when my 2.5-year-old son crawled into bed with my husband and me, Unable to fall back asleep, I decided to work on a craft project in my craft room. About 45 minutes in, the small monitor connected to our nanny cams started flickering rapidly. This was odd because they weren't motion sensor cameras but continuous feed ones, covering the living room and my son's bedroom. Curious and a bit unnerved, I picked up the monitor. Suddenly, it emitted a loud, ear-piercing sound like microphone feedback. Startled, I dropped the monitor face down. When I picked it up again and looked at the screen, I froze. My son was standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the wall as still as a statue. It was eerie, seeing him like that in the dead of night. I headed for the door, monitor in hand, but when I glanced down again, what I saw made my stomach drop. His head turned, just the head, and his eyes locked onto the camera in the upper corner of the room. His face was expressionless, void of any emotion. It was like looking at a shell of my son. I rushed through the small kitchen and dining room to the living room. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and confusion swirling in my mind. But when I got there, the living room was empty, no sign of my son. I hurried to our bedroom, where my husband was still up, reading on his e-reader. Our son was there, asleep in the same position as when we'd gone to bed. It was as if he hadn't moved at all. My husband confirmed he hadn't left the bed since lying down, and our son had been there, snoring peacefully the whole time. I couldn't wrap my head around what I had seen on the monitor. It was as if I had witnessed a doppelganger of my son, a perfect emotionless copy. We'd experienced brief glimpses of doppelgangers in the past, but they were always so fleeting that you barely had time to register what you saw. But this was different. This wasn't a mere glimpse. It was a prolonged, unsettling encounter. The most chilling part was the look on my son's face when he turned to the camera. That empty, void stare haunts me to this day. I spent the rest of the night awake, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. I kept checking on my son, ensuring it was really him, sleeping in the bed, and not some otherworldly imposter. The next day, I scoured the internet for explanations. Doppelgangers, apparitions, glitches in reality. The theories were endless, but none offered any real comfort. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it as a trick of light or a technical glitch with the camera. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something beyond the realm of normal. This story is about my brother, Travis Michael, who passed away tragically in 2005, and a strange connection that surfaced years later with my young cousin, who he never met. Growing up, I was the youngest of three brothers. Travis, the middle one, was the life of our family, charismatic, athletic, and always up for a game of basketball. His death left a void in our family that we've never quite managed to fill. Fast forward a few years after Travis's passing, and my cousin gives birth to a boy. This kid never met Travis, never heard stories about him. He was just a typical kid with a vivid imagination. Or so we thought. When the boy was around 5, he started talking about his imaginary friend Michael. Kids often have imaginary friends, so it wasn't a big deal at first. But then the details he shared began to send chills down our spines. He'd tell his mom about how Michael would wake him up at night, wanting to play basketball. Odd, considering basketball wasn't something a 5-year-old would normally be keen on, but Travis loved it. He played all through high school. But what really got to us was when he mentioned that Michael had an ouchie on his throat. That struck a raw nerve. Travis had died in a freak TV accident at the San Luis Obispo sand dunes, which shattered his Adam's apple and led to his suffocation. How could this boy know such a specific detail? The eeriness escalated when my mom visited my aunt. She was sitting in the living room when my cousin and her son walked in. The boy hesitated, gave my mom a long, searching look, and then retreated to his room. My cousin, looking equally puzzled and spooked, came over to my mom and said, "He's being shy because he thinks you're Michael's mom." But the real kicker, when shown a photo of Travis, the boy pointed right at it and said, "That's Michael. Even when I visited, the same thing happened," he whispered to my cousin. "That's Michael's brother." You see, my brother's full name was Travis Michael, but we always just called him Travis. There was no way this kid could have known about the Michael part, let alone connect it to a photo of my brother. I've always been a skeptic, but this shook me. How could a boy who never met Travis, who was born years after his death, know so much about him? It wasn't just the basketball or the injury. It was the recognition, the way he looked at photos of Travis, the way he identified my mom and me. Some say kids are more open to the spiritual world, that they see things we adults can't or won't. Maybe Travis's spirit lingered, seeking solace in the laughter of a child. Maybe it was just a series of eerie coincidences. Or maybe, in some unfathomable way, this boy's innocent mind bridged a gap between our world and whatever lies beyond. We never got answers. As the boy grew older, his talks of Michael faded. It was as if he'd outgrown an imaginary friend, or perhaps as if Travis had found peace, knowing his family was moving on. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to the paranormal. But there's one experience that shook my beliefs to the core, involving my best friend's boyfriend who claimed he could see and feel spirits. Here's what happened. It was a typical Saturday night at my house. My best friend, her boyfriend, and I were hanging out, just chatting and catching up. Her boyfriend, let's call him Mark, was the kind of guy who always had a story to top yours. So when he once mentioned his ability to sense ghosts, I brushed it off as another of his tall tales. That night, as we were talking, Mark suddenly went silent and still. His face lost all color, and he looked almost frightened. My best friend noticed and asked what was wrong. He whispered that he felt a presence in the house, a strong one. He told us to keep chatting and act normal while he tried to feel for it. I rolled my eyes but played along. A while later, Mark broke his silence. He said the spirit was in the kitchen and that it felt male. Unlike other spirits he had encountered, this one seemed benevolent, like a guardian angel. I was still skeptical, but his seriousness made me pause. Mark's next words sent chills down my spine. He asked if my mom had ever had a miscarriage. I felt my heart stop for a moment. My mom had indeed miscarried before having me. It was a family secret, one that not even my best friend knew about. Mark continued, saying the spirit was trying to communicate a name, something starting with the letter A. At this point, I was trembling. My mom had always said if her first child, a boy, had lived, she would have named him Alex. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could Mark have known? He explained that he believed the spirit was my unborn older brother, watching over my mother as a guardian angel. The timing was uncanny. My mother was going through a tough phase, struggling with depression. Mark speculated that Alex's spirit was there to comfort her, to help her through her difficult time. I was stunned, unable to speak. The room felt heavy with an unseen presence. It was as if the air itself had changed, becoming thicker, charged with an inexplicable energy. The next day, I told my mother about the encounter. Her reaction was one of shock and tears. She'd always sensed a presence around her, especially during her darkest times, but she thought it was her grandfather, with whom she'd been close. The idea that it could be her unborn son, watching over her as a protector, was both heartbreaking and comforting. That experience changed everything for me. I went from a skeptic to a believer, or at least someone more open to the possibilities of the unknown. Mark's ability, which I'd once dismissed, now seemed undeniable. This story isn't just mine, it's my mother's too. It brought her a sense of peace, a feeling that she wasn't alone in her struggles. As for me, I often find myself wondering about the unseen world around us, the spirits that might be walking beside us, unseen but ever present. Click on this next video if you enjoyed for more content like this, and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel.